Hi, everyone, and welcome to this exciting edition of Inside Tauck. My name is Dustin Smith, and I work here on the marketing team at Tauck. Thank you for taking the time to join us today from wherever you happen to be logging in from. Inside Tauck is our monthly virtual event series designed to educate, inform, and inspire future travel. We tap into our wonderful partners, our tour architects, our tour directors from around the world to give you just a small taste and education of what you might expect on tour with us. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by two true experts in their field. Dr. Stefan Petersen, a wildlife biologist of more than 20 years, specializing in Arctic marine mammals, and our very own Rob White, a Tauck tour director of more than 15 years, leading journeys in Canada, Antarctica, Europe, and all over the world. So before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items on our end. You are all on mute. If you do have questions, please type them into the chat function at the bottom of your screen. We'll be answering questions throughout the event, and we'll try our best to get to as many of them as possible. I will answer what I can as we go along, but we'll wait for the end to ask the more detailed questions of our presenters. I know many of you probably have questions about your upcoming travel and wonder about the necessary procedures and tour specifics. We're not going to be getting into that much today. If you do have those questions, please direct them to our reservations team at Tauck. This presentation will last roughly 1 hour, and it is being recorded. So if you do have a friend who wants to join or watch it later, they can do so tomorrow afternoon on our blog page. You will all receive an email with the recording. We are also live streaming this event on Facebook. So if you have anyone who wants to join last minute, or if you have any Zoom technical difficulties, you can join us live on Tauck's Facebook page. We'll be sharing images and a couple animations along the way. And just so you know, on your screen, you have the option to toggle a vertical bar left and right to either make the speaker bigger or make the images bigger. So do that as you please. And I think that's it from me. So without any further ado, I will turn this over to Dr. Petersen. Take it away.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm super happy to be joining everyone to talk about, one of my favorite places to travel. I always struggle with titles, and I know we're focused on bears for this. That's the big draw for Churchill, but I can't let an opportunity go by to talk about seals and belugas as well, both of which I do research on in Churchill. So my position is actually with Assiniboine Park Zoo, and I'm the Director of Conservation and Research there. To orient everyone, the zoo is in Winnipeg, Manitoba, about 1,000 kilometers south of Churchill and the Hudson's Bay, where we do a lot of our research. It's also kind of the stopping place, so you'll fly into or arrive in Winnipeg to get to Churchill. So my background, even though I'm now at a zoo, has been all over Canada, studying everything from tiny little shrews all the way up to bowhead whales. This is a photo from when I was working with the Federal Fisheries Department here in Canada on narwhal. So I've been really honored to be able to actually have hands-on a real live narwhal, which is incredible. Don't see any narwhal in Churchill, but super cool species. We also worked in the north tagging seals. So this is a field team sitting on a little ring seal to glue a transmitter on their back. So some pretty amazing opportunities throughout my career to work in the wild. So you might actually think, it's a bit of a jump to start working at a zoo. And so the attraction to make that move really is you have a place where we have, veterinarians, highly trained animal care professionals, and conservation scientists with opportunities to work with really incredible incredible animals like polar bears, And then also a really great opportunity to communicate that science to visitors that are coming through the zoo. So it's really a great place to bring a whole bunch of things on the conservation science side together. I'll put in a few shameless plugs. So if you're in Canada, you can watch Arctic Vets that focuses on our veterinary team and has segments that deal with the conservation team and what we're doing. And even though the focus of this talk and what we're doing is in the Arctic, we also work on other species in Manitoba, including this little cutie here, which is the critically endangered Poweshiek skipperling, which is a little prairie butterfly. But bears are really what we're going to chat about today. I've been going up to Churchill specifically for, I think, about the last 10 years, and usually 3 or more trips per year to study seals in the spring generally, and then belugas in the summer. And then not only to do some research on bears, but also to provide educational opportunities. So to work with tour groups to talk about bears and why they're so awesome. When I'm talking about bears, I know there's lots of controversy. There are these icons of the North, but they're also a symbol of climate change, and they're in this position partially because they're reliant on ice for their day-to-day, but they're also in that place because there's been a research program that's been studying polar bears out of Churchill for the last, I think, almost 30 years. So this is done by researchers from across Canada and from the federal government. And so we have this enormous data set and long-term data set that really helps us understand the relationship that polar bears have to sea ice. And it's a really tight one. So whenever I'm talking about polar bears and specifically climate change, I generally start with a couple slides that are always the same. And one is just trying to give folks a sense at how big the range of polar bears are. So Hudson's Bay, which is down at the bottom, where the red dot, which is Churchill, is about 1,000 kilometers across and 1,000 kilometers kind of top to bottom. From the Bear Range in the Russian Arctic to Hudson's Bay is about 6,000 kilometers. And even though bears could potentially move that far in their lifespan, they probably don't make that complete trek. But the important part of this is you wouldn't expect the conditions that bears are experiencing across this enormous range to be the same in every location and across this range. And that variation within that range is part of the reason that we have a lot of conflicting opinions about the state of bears and where bears will be in, say, 10 years or 20 years. The other thing I wanted to put out, I've thrown in this nice little picture of a mom and her cub on the sea ice. This was just out in Hudson's Bay off the coast. Counting bears is hard. So this is white bears on a white background. That's most of the year. So it's expensive and it's difficult to count bears, and that doesn't help us try and understand what the numbers are. The second slide that I always like to show is just an annual cycle of freeze and thaw in the Arctic. So you can see as this cycles through, Hudson's Bay is going from completely ice covered to completely ice free. And that's a normal year for Hudson's Bay. If you look in the high Arctic, in the Canadian Arctic archipelago to the north, there's ice there almost all year round. So whether that's little birdie bits and icebergs in there or completely solid, bears in the north always have sea ice. Bears in the south are on shore for a big part of the year. And this means that, again, as we get this warming trend in the atmosphere, we're not going to expect that entire area to change at the same rate and in the same on the same time. We think the path is the same. Eventually, we'll get to the same conclusion if we keep warming everything up. But within that, there's going to be a lot of variation. And so in the high Arctic, we're going from multi-year thick ice. It's really not that great a seal habitat to more of an annual ice system. And so bear populations in the Canadian high Arctic tend to be stable because they still have access to ice and they still have access to seals. In the further south, we have an area that's made up of seasonal sea ice, so the area in green. And this is ice that forms and thaws every year. And it's really great habitat for seals. But as things warm up, we lose that ice, and that's the habitat that polar bears need to access seals and get out there. And so within Hudson's Bay, we have a really interesting situation too, because we have this projection of the Arctic really far south. So in Hudson's Bay, we have great conditions to pull the Arctic south. Maybe in the dead of winter, people around the bay are not super jazzed that they're pulling the Arctic south, but the Hudson's Bay doesn't have a lot of warm currents that are coming through like you would in the ocean. It gets lots of freshwater input, so that lowers the salinity and raises the temperature at which the ice will freeze. And all those things work together. And you can see on that map to draw the range of polar bears, the Arctic conditions further into the south. But being further in the south also puts things at risk, because that's where you would expect to see the biggest changes in response to climate change. And that is what we see. So over, since the 1980s, we've seen about a month more open water for polar bears. And this is mostly in earlier freeze up or earlier breakup in the spring. So breakup time has gone forward about 3 weeks, and then later freeze up in the fall. So freeze up tends to be a week later currently. And so what that does is the spring is really when polar bears are making hay. They're out on the sea ice. There's lots of naive young seal pups that are, little smarties on the sea ice, little blubber balls out there. So their success in hunting is really high. They're able to put on a lot of weight. And if you shorten that, or if that time period gets shortened, that gives all the bears in that population less time to gain the resources they're going to need for their time on land, or if they're females, an even longer time, up to 8 months, where they're not eating because they're in a den giving birth. And then as that time on the fall gets longer, they're also fasting for longer because they're not able to get back out on the sea ice. So that's putting those bears in the south and in Hudson's Bay at a higher risk. And if you look at these graphs that I've put up here, you'll also notice another thing, which is there's a lot of variability. So there's good years, there's bad years, there's early freeze ups, there's late freeze ups. And that's always been part of the Arctic ecosystem. And species that are in the Arctic are actually really well adapted to having that variability in the system. For polar bears, one of the ways that they get around a lot of that variability is being long-lived. And so, if they can't reproduce 1 year, they can reproduce the next year or maybe 2 years down the road. So being a long-lived, slow to reproduce species allows them to gain resources in the good years and then capitalize on them as well. And so within that variability, we still have this overall trend, and that's the concerning part, this trend where it's variable, but it's around a different set of kind of parameters. And what we've seen in the population for polar bears in the Western Hudson's Bay is from the 1980s to the mid-1990s, we saw about, I think it's like an 18% decline in the population. But since that time, had this stable population where there's fluctuations, but the population itself has been around 800 or so animals, where that's the population estimate. So pretty stable. So that seems like, okay, with stable population, we can be okay with that. The concerning thing is, as we see these changes in the environment, we're also seeing changes in the polar bears themselves. So on average, the weight of female polar bears in the summer has decreased. And so the less heavy they are means the less resources they have to have a baby and successfully raise those offspring. So we have that trend. We see fewer mums with triplets and twins. So we think the productivity is going down. And we know from recent research in southern Hudson's Bay, which is in the Ontario side of the Hudson's Bay populations, or the Hudson's Bay polar bears, recently there was a 15% drop in those population estimates. So we think that, we're really not seeing this gradual long-term decline. What we see is like big steps down in that population as the conditions change. So one of the things that we need is good numbers, and those are, logistically challenging and expensive and dangerous to do. There was an aerial survey that was flown last year, so everyone's pretty excited to see the new estimates that come out of that. I'm pretty hopeful that the numbers are at least stable. And within that, I think one of the things that we know is we do have this variability. So in 2020, for the first time in all of my years going to Churchill, I saw a mum with triplets, which is incredible. In the 80s, this was a common thing. In some of the other populations, so in the Chukchi in recent history, there was lots of triplets being produced, but it really shows that like these bears are resilient, and if we can put enough good years together, they can respond with triplets and that increasing population. So really great year in 2020. In 2021, I think I went up for 6 days on the tundra, and even though others saw cubs, I didn't see any cubs. So I saw yearlings, but not cubs. So it can really change based on those conditions in the bay, which you can think, oh, that's kind of worrisome, but I think that should give us hope that, if we can wrangle climate emissions and stabilize kind of the warming, polar bears do have the resilience and the ability to respond to some of these things. And so, this is a pretty rare event for Churchill these days. If you're going to Churchill, awesome, cute polar bears are, what you go for and what you're served up, which is great. If you're lucky, you might see polar bears sparring. So my group has done some research on trying to find non-invasive ways to study the energetics. So they're doing this really, looks like a lot of energy consuming activity at a time when they haven't eaten for 3 or 4 months. It seems counterintuitive. So we want to understand, are they spending that much energy, or is it inconsequential? And figure out better ways to do things, and we can do that at the zoo. So while folks are out in Churchill, there's actually a pretty sophisticated system that's kind of in the background, keeping bears and people safe. And so this is the polar bear alert team's job. And so they'll move bears through Churchill, because Churchill is kind of right on the path of where bears want to go, and they head north. They might trap bears and put them into the polar bear handling facilities there and hold them for a time before either letting them out onto the ice if the ice is formed, or flying them further north along their path to get them, on their way, so they're moving further to the north. Within that realm, there are always, and probably always have been, at-risk bears, so orphan cubs, both because we don't know why they're orphans, so they've been separated from their mom, maybe by other bears, maybe from wolves, sometimes by human conflict. And so in province, certain bears, so orphan cubs below a certain age that are the result of human conflict, have the opportunity, or the province can choose to move them down to our facility in Winnipeg. So here's a couple nervous little orphan cubs just after coming down to the zoo one year. And so those bears that are coming down to our zoo are acting as ambassadors for their species. And then they're also participating in research with us. So currently we're doing things like trying to understand how the hair grows. So how fast does hair grow? Because biologists in the field will often pluck hairs and then be able to look at what kind of contaminants the bears have been exposed to, what they're eating, what they've been exposed to. All these different things are in those hair, but we need to know, is that 1 month when they were molting, or is it growing continuously over the stretch of their lifespan? And then we're also looking at ways that we can contribute to management of bears in the wild. So currently we're looking at the overlap of fire risk in Manitoba with polar bear denning, because the bears in southern Hudson's Bay, at least, will den in peat and in inland, and then move out onto the sea ice, which is unusual for most bears. And so we want to know, especially after the fire year last year, where do we want to, we need to know where these things happen, so we can, proactively maybe fight forest fires in certain areas in order to protect polar bear habitat. And so currently we have 9 polar bears at Assiniboine Park Zoo that are either orphans or at-risk bears. And so that's really given us a focus, or the impetus, to study polar bears in more depth, but also to look at the whole ecosystem that they're living in. And so I often joke that if you are on a tour with me, I'm going to spend all of my time trying to convince you that seals are cooler and more interesting than polar bears. I've never actually convinced anyone of that, but that's generally my goal. And I think they're so amazing, partially because they're supporting this really great polar bear population. But in Churchill, there's 3 seals that are common: bearded seals, ring seals, and harbor seals. And for the ring seals and the harbor seals, we have a really interesting pair that we can look at the climate effects on 2 species. And one species, ring seal, which is on the top, are really highly adapted to the Arctic. They're the species I think of when I think about Arctic adaptations. But then we also have harbor seals, which we think of as more of a temperate seal species. So not as good in the Arctic. And our research has shown that since the late 90s to now, the harbor seal population has been increasing, probably in response to, the winters aren't as severe, the ice isn't as packed in. They're able to, get out of the Hudson's Bay and into the rivers early in the spring to have pups. So there's a little pup down there with the one harbor seal. And so they're able to increase their population numbers. And so we want to understand, how they're making a living and how they're responding to changes in temperature. Whereas ring seals, where our predictions are that they're going to be not doing as well. But like polar bears, to a certain extent, they're very hard to actually count. So we've been working on trying to come up with ways to get an index of that population to understand how ring seals are doing. And partially because we know ring seals are supporting the bears in the system. They will take harbor seals, they take bearded seals, they'll take beluga, but really the bread and butter, or the butter and butter, are those ring seals. And so we're doing quite a bit of work on them. We also are studying beluga whales. So beluga whales come into the estuaries in Western Hudson's Bay in the summer. In the Churchill estuary, there's a great ecotourism has been built up around seeing polar bear or seeing belugas in the summer, and it's one that's growing. So what we do is we have underwater cameras. So we have partners that live stream underwater beluga imagery. So if you want to have a day disappear or 4 hours in the afternoon disappear on you, pull that up during the summer on explore.org and watch and listen to the live beluga whales. Super distracting. But all this great imagery that we can learn so much about belugas. So we take the images, and then we have another citizen science platform and a program called Beluga Bits, where people from around the world can help us classify those images. And so if you're interested in that, another plug, if you hold your camera up to the QR code, it should take you to Beluga Bits, but it's over, I think we just crossed 21,000 people from around the world have helped out on this project. And you get to see cool beluga pictures from underwater, which is pretty rare, as well as helping out my team on understanding the natural history of beluga, but also the threats that they're facing, because we often see scars and markings and all sorts of things on these whales. So the other, I would say, moderately selfish reason for studying beluga is it means that we get to go to Churchill in the summer and see some pretty incredible things. So this is adorable beluga calf from a few years ago. But also, part of the whole, the whole system, the whole ecosystem that you can experience in Churchill is really incredible. So I know this is, focused on bears. There's another QR code if you want to learn more about what we're doing at the zoo, but really, Churchill is just this incredible place at any time of the year. So if you're able to come and see polar bears and enjoy it, it's incredible. I think Rob would echo my my words on that. And so with that, I will finish talking, and I'm open to questions. Rob, I think you had some things that you might want to say more specific to the tour. I'll pass it over.
Thanks, Dr. Petersen. Yeah, let's Rob, why don't you go ahead and just talk a little bit about the tour we offer, and then we'll come back together after that and answer some questions. There's been a ton of questions asked, and Rob, thanks for chiming in on the chat for a couple of them, but we'll come back and ask some of those questions that were asked. But Rob, why don't you go ahead and just talk to the tour a little bit.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to say hello to anybody watching who I've traveled with before and I've been on tour with before. Hope to see you again. And for those who are curious about polar bears, the tour is exceptional. I get asked all the time as to, can we fit it into our schedule? At 5 days long, many people enjoy it because they can fit it into their schedule. People ask us who the best time to go. We usually begin the tour around Halloween, or the 25th, 26th of October. And we then go onward to the middle of November. It's a very select number of departures, Dustin. I believe 6 departures overall. but it's 5 days. It's beautiful. We start up in Winnipeg. We charter a plane to take us very comfortably up into Churchill. It's a 2.5-hour plane ride. It's our own plane that we charter. And we get up there, we do an orientation of Churchill, and fascinating little town. So much culture, so much history. And we then, wonderful food at Lazy Bear Lodge, very comfortable accommodation. It's rustic, but each room is handcrafted in logs and very cozy, wood burning fire in the lobby. And then of course we take off out onto the tundra, and we go out there on these brand new, actually the newest Tundra vehicles in Churchill. We have, and they're called Tundra Crawlers. We go out. They even have USBs to keep your iPhones charged or your Androids. You can get all those pictures without having to worry about your phone losing charge. They're very comfortable. We're served lunch on board, and the food is hearty. It's tasty. There's an observation deck on the back where you can actually, if we're very, very lucky, and if a polar bear comes to the vehicle, it can be literally under your feet. Complete safety. There's zero attrition on this tour, so we don't lose anybody. But it is exceptional to be so close to the world's largest land carnivore, and to be able to look one right in the eye, it sort of takes your breath away. And I know that there are people chiming in with questions, and you know, this is typical because people, when I'm on tour in different places, and they ask me which other tours I run, whenever I mention the Manitoba Polar Bear Adventure, they are immediately fascinated. And for many people, they say, oh, I've always wanted to do that, or I'm curious about polar bears. Are there more bears now than there were before? Are they in danger? There's a lot of learning on the tour. We've got great people, local guides, and we go to Parks Canada for a very, very interesting interpretive while we're there. We have local people. Alex DeVries Magnifico was featured in Canadian Geographic. He's an exceptional photographer. We go to his gallery and have a wonderful presentation, and you see it through the eyes of someone local, you know. And there's a lot to Manitoba. There's a lot to Churchill, and just like Dr. Petersen had said, you know, the polar bears are the focus, but there's so much more up there, and it's really a remarkable trip. It's one of my favorites. I love it.
Thanks, Rob. Appreciate that. We'll get into some questions, and just so everyone knows, for those of you who are asking right now, we in 2022 this tour is almost sold out. There are a little bit of space left. So if you'd like to, please take a look at Tauck.
Dustin, can I chime in there for a second?
Yep, go ahead.
That's a really good point. And many people on tour will say that they couldn't book because it's sold out. It's constantly sold out. Part of the reason for that is because we're there in prime polar bear time. So that means less departures, and the groups are typically smaller. But if you can't make a booking for 2022, make it for 2023, make it for 2024. Just get in when you can, and you'll be glad you did. It's special, but Dustin, I'm glad to hear there's still a little bit of space left for 2022. That's
a little bit, yeah.
Okay, good.
Let's go all the way back, because there are a lot of people asking about the Northern Lights.
You're a very curious group.
At the beginning,
the questions come up, yeah.
At the beginning of the talk and now. So I don't know, Rob or Dr. Petersen, whoever wants to kind of address the Northern Lights. Rob, from a tour perspective, obviously, if we get to witness them or not, or how that actually works, I don't know. So I will leave that up to the experts.
Yes. Churchill is the polar bear capital of the world. It's also the beluga capital of the world and the Northern Lights capital of the world. And the thing is, we can and we do see them in Churchill during polar bear season, but until the bay ice freezes over, to be honest, we're still getting quite a bit of moisture and cloud cover because of the ice not being frozen or freezing over the bay. So we can see them, we do see them. It's never a guarantee. But once the bay freezes over, the bears then take to the ice. So in the wintertime in particular, my friends are posting a lot of photos up there from right now. The Northern Lights are incredible once the bay freezes over, but I will warn everybody, that if you're on tour, I'm going to tell you that if the lights come out, I'm going to wake you up from your bed. And so we'll come around and we can knock on your door. You could be in your pajamas, and people just throw their coats on and they go outside. We get everyone gathered outside to witness them if it happens. And it's not a guarantee, but it is possible, to be fair and honest with you.
Thanks, Rob. Anything you want to layer on to that, Dr. Petersen, about the Northern Lights?
I was just going to say that's what makes a great tour guide, because I often wake up when I'm in the fall doing these, and I'll wake up in the morning and they're like, "Why didn't you wake us up?" It's like, I'm not going to go out and see Northern Lights. I'll see bears, but
You
Northern
don't want
Lights.
to risk the wrath.
No, that's for other people.
I wake them up.
Yeah.
So several questions that came in, Dr. Petersen, about just the how long lived the polar bears are in general, and you may have touched on it, but if you don't mind going into it again or speaking to that, that would be great. I think a lot of people were interested in that, in their lifespan.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so they're in the wild, they're probably, living to about 20 years. Males and females live a bit longer. Males are a bit fighty, so they kind of get past their prime and decline pretty quickly. So I think of them as a long-lived species, but then like ring seals, I think the longest ring seal is 40 years old in the wild, whereas I don't think the longest lived wild polar bear is over 30. There's longer ones that have lived in human care, but in the wild, it's a tough life. And when your teeth start to give out, you don't become as good of a hunter, and then it's a pretty harsh environment. So they tend to live to mid-20s in that range.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And Rob answered this question in the chat, but it might be helpful for others as you were going through polar bear cubs, and how many cubs per birth is normal, and what do you typically see, and what are maybe outside of those normal ranges? And then, sorry, we'll get into the next question after. I'll let you answer that one first.
Yeah, that's a great question. So typical is twins, but it's really closely tied to body condition. So if the female comes off the ice in the spring and is like 400 kilograms of roly-poly blubber, she'll be able to have triplets. If she's coming off and pretty lean, don't think that bears that are under 180 kilograms can successfully have cubs at all. So they can have only one, but generally the expectation is that they'll have twins. And polar bears are cool in that they have delayed implantation. So they'll mate in the spring, but that embryo won't actually implant and start growing until later into the fall. And so this means that, females can mate and be ready, but then if they have a poor spring and don't have the resources, they can reabsorb that embryo and go back out on the sea ice. They won't dam up and try again in future years. So again, just like really adaptable to the variability and the uncertainty of that Arctic environment.
Interesting. Very interesting.
That is fascinating. Also, Dr. Petersen will probably agree, like how the bears have evolved to become these hunters, these ringed seal hunters. Even their claws, their snouts, they're fascinating animals, and they're incredibly intelligent, extremely intelligent.
Yeah, they really are. I mean, there's folks that could make many careers out of just trying to figure out what's going through a polar bear's mind. I have a little bit of it, but I get distracted by other species as well. But yeah, so fascinating. And just, when you're out there and just get a chance to sit back and watch a bear, meander across the tundra, it's fascinating to think of, like, what are they smelling? They clearly know that you're there. Maybe they're feigning like to ignore you. Maybe they come and approach, but it's just, yeah, it's really special to be able to watch and try and figure out what the behavior is, what's going on in their mind.
A question just came through about that. How do bears communicate? Which I think is an interesting question.
Yeah, they have a few different ways. So they have really great smell. So some of the things are communicated through smell. So we know from research that male bears can identify when a female is looking for love, and also make that identification by smelling the snow that she's walked through. So just looking at and smelling the tracks, and then knowing as well, either through smell or through vision, which way she's going, so they can adjust their path and follow her. And then we know also that they have a lot of, postural communications. So how they're looking at one another and sizing each other up. They have yawns. They have remarkably kind of mobile lips, so they can like purse their lips and kind of communicate to other bears just by the facial postures. They're pretty quiet when they're sparring, but if you get circumstances where a female with cubs is telling a male to shove off, they can be vocal then as well. But generally not as much vocalization, because there's usually always a wind, and sound doesn't really carry that well in the Arctic compared to other things. Yeah.
That's also fascinating. I can't wait to get together with you, Dr. Petersen, in Churchill for a dinner, but I'm going to pick your brain even more. But I've also heard that, their sense of smell is so incredible. They can actually smell a seal more than 4 miles across the ice. They have this directional nose. They can move it. And, often if it gets quite windy, they'll hunker down in the snow. And you probably observe that behavior because they depend so much on their sense of smell. And a female, with cubs in particular, will avoid males at all costs. And that's why they're constantly smelling and looking around. And again, just another example of how they've evolved into this incredible creatures. I love them.
Yeah. There's been, some great research that looked at like wind direction and how bears hunt in different speeds of wind. Because, if you've got a low wind, then you can kind of go crosswind and get a good sense of what's coming down at you. But if the wind is high, it's not going to tell you really that much. It'll just go back too fast. So when the wind is high, bears will change their hunting strategy to be one that relies more on visual cues, because that wind isn't really telling them anything. But yeah, so adaptable and so, keyed into the environment and many times single-minded on finding what they want to eat.
Yeah. Surviving, yes. I wanted to get into the orphan cubs a bit. There's some questions about that in the at-risk polar bears that you take into the zoo. Do you, kind of how do you nurture them? What do they eat when they're with you at the zoo? And then B, those orphan cubs, do you ever release them back out into the wild?
Yeah, those are great questions. So the cubs that come down are generally about 11 months old. And this is because usually when they're coming through Churchill, they tend to be that age. They were born probably in December. They were out on the sea ice with their mom. And then sometime during the summer or around bear season, maybe when there's more bears, they've been separated from mom, or there's more people and there's been human bear conflict. So it's those kind of 11-month-old bears that are eligible to come down to our facility. And by that time, even though they're still nursing, they'll have also been on the ice getting a taste of seal and solid foods and blubber with their mom in the spring. So by the time they come to us, we can transition them onto our regular bear diet. Sometimes it takes a little bit because they're used to eating one thing and they're getting all these new novel things, but bears are pretty curious and they'll try and eat a lot of things. So it usually we've never had a problem with bears not wanting to eat what we provide them at the zoo. And then on the releasing side of things, it's something that, we have a lot of conversations about, but currently there's really no appetite to take on the risk of a habituated bear being released into the wild. So if a bear came down to our facility, they'd get used to people, they would associate people with feeding them. If we put them back on the landscape, they're either going to be back in Churchill the hot second they could to get a meal, or even worse, they might wander further north into communities in Nunavut where they don't have a polar bear alert program that's as kind of developed as they do in Churchill. And that poses a real human health risk. So until we figure out, how to get a cub raised to the age and size that it could survive with the skills, because hunting seals is quite a specialized set of skills, and not have them habituated, the bears that come down, and these are bears that would have otherwise died in the wild, so we're not affecting the population trajectory. They come down to our facility and they'll be with us or at another facility being ambassadors for their species for the remainder of their life.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
I'm going to ask you, well, there's a million more questions I could ask you that what's coming, but I found another interesting one that Rob kind of spoke to a little while ago, and then Rob will get into some more tour questions after. I guess the evolution of the polar bear. The question was, are polar bears related to grizzlies? And so I guess if you could speak to the evolution of the polar bear, and also their relationship to the people they live around was another interesting question as well.
Yeah. So my background is genetics. So it's been a fascinating 5 years, 10 years of polar bear genetics and genomics. But whenever I, start talking about genetics, people either drift off into slumber or think I'm, cloning polar bears in the secret lair. So what we found out is all of the species of bears are able to interbreed and produce offspring. They're not always viable offspring, but they can produce. So it's a relatively rapid diversification. Grizzly bears and polar bears are sister species. So they share a common ancestor most recently. And we know in certain places they do hybridize, but it only seems like in one place, and the genetics has indicated that it's likely only one female and her offspring that hybridize, not the whole population. So, something's going on there with that lineage. It probably doesn't exist anymore because most of what we know about those bears are from harvested bears. So they've been pulled out of the population. We also know that even though polar bears and grizzly bears have bred in the past at times, the genes for polar bears will show up in brown bears and grizzly bears, but grizzly bear genes don't show up in polar bears. So we think that polar bears, even though it's a fairly recent split between those two lineages, being a polar bear is such a specialized way of making a life. If you have grizzly bear genes, they don't help you and you're not as successful. So there are lots of cool ways that genetics has helped us understand polar bears and grizzly bears and that relationship. In terms of the relationship that people have with bears in the Arctic, it's really fascinating, and it's one that as a white Southerner, I came into this career with a lot of preconceptions about what that relationship should be between people and bears. And so working in the north and talking to folks has been really fascinating in terms of having to shift my whole perspective to understand that within Canada at least, we have subsistence hunts and cultural, like really culturally important interactions, and what we would think of as like, oh, you can't kill a polar bear, but that's a way of life. It's a way of maintaining a culture. It's a way of keeping communities together. There's all these social and cultural values that are wrapped into living with polar bears and being, having polar bears of that system and interacting, and that involves subsistence hunting in the Canadian Arctic. So in Churchill, in Manitoba, we don't have hunting of polar bears, but further north in Canada, it's a piece of people's life that you can't pull away without degrading that culture. And so when you're going into those communities or interacting with those people, it's something that you really have to be careful and cognizant about, just kind of taking on and being open-minded to a completely different way of viewing the relationship between people and polar bears in particular, but wildlife in general.
That's a great answer. Very interesting kind of, no, seriously, I mean, it's incredibly interesting. Rob, you look like you want to add on, so go ahead.
It is, and with Dr. Petersen, you get the real deal, right? And that's the truth. I know people have asked as to, are there more bears now than before? Are there less bears with the climate change, with global warming? My feeling is that depends on who you speak with. I've heard people in Churchill say there are more bears now. There are more coming ashore because the ice is breaking up earlier. So with less sea ice, more are coming to shore. Other people up north will say less. And so it's really hard to say from my experience. I'm sure Dr. Petersen has more to say on that. But there's so much more to the tour, to his point, and so much more to Manitoba. The bears are the celebrities for sure and the focus. And it's an incredible place to see them. Someone asked me if it's better in Svelgard or Churchill to see bears. I have never been skunked on a polar bear tour in Churchill. Of course, there are never guarantees with wildlife. These are wild animals, as you all know. But someone asked what the highlight is. There are so many. Between the ptarmigan and the Arctic hare and the opportunity for other wildlife. But the topography and the landscape of Churchill is mind-boggling. Like you're out there and you're in this big vehicle. It's very cozy. It's heated nice and warm. But the Hudson Bay gray wacky, the rock, is over 2 billion years old. It's some of the oldest exposed rock on the planet. I mean, we're on the edge of the tundra. The subarctic tundra is where we are. And the landscape itself, it veers right off to looking down. It goes this dense woods, and all of a sudden here we are in this incredible landscape. And it's unlike anything I've ever done before or anywhere I've ever traveled before. And it's just a completely unique, very special destination. And it will leave you with memories. It'll leave you with a lot of memories.
Speaking of that, Rob, do you have any particular memories on any one of your many tours that you've run here or anywhere? Yes. That is interesting to share with the guests on who
yes.
are on?
I didn't get a chance to get that question. I saw it, so thank you for that. We had a polar bear come to the Tundra Crawler on one particular tour and actually poke his head in through the window of the vehicle. And so we were reminding everyone back, and they did. The guests are very, very aware, and they know not to have scarves dangling. If there is a bear that comes to the vehicle, we don't bait bears. We don't feed bears. We don't entice bears. If they don't want to be around us, they don't have to be. We don't chase them. But if we're lucky enough to have some come close to the vehicle, and Dustin, by the way, has some pictures he'll be putting up on the website afterwards. You can look at some of those, how we got really close-up shots safely with a zoom lens. But that was really memorable. And if they do come close, to see them in their natural habitat. And, they're just, you can't compare them to anything else. People will make the comparison between grizzly bears and polar bears. but the bears are the largest land carnivores on the planet. And to see them doing what they naturally do, to see them along the shores of the Hudson Bay and they're munching on seaweed or kelp to get their digestive systems going. They haven't eaten in months. They have the longest fasting period of any mammal that we know of. So they're living completely off their fat reserves. But then when you see them getting ready, the ice is starting to form. They're getting more active. They're getting more anticipating the ice. And we can sometimes see them sparring. The juveniles, we see the mothers cuddled up with the cubs. The cubs cuddled right in, snuggled in with the mom. It's just crazy. I mean, it's so, there's so many words I can use to describe it. And many guests are chiming in here now, you can see on the chat, because they've taken the tour. And my advice would be to get on the ask and share section, Dustin, of the tour, and just read their comments. Read the comments from your fellow travelers who've been there. And I hope to see you there. And Manitoba is so diverse and so special, from Winnipeg all the way up to Churchill. They call it Friendly Manitoba for a reason. And any time of the year, it's exceptional. Polar bears, of course, are going to want to come this time of the year. But like Dr. Petersen mentioned, the seal population, incredible on Hudson Bay and so fascinating. But the birds, many people who are interested in birding will want to know that Manitoba is a hotspot. It's along a migratory bird corridor. So they have literally hundreds of species of birds that go up and down and back and forth through Manitoba. So the ptarmigan that we talked about, and many, many other things, just makes Manitoba fascinating, the whole thing.
Thanks, Rob. And that's a very good close. I will, Dr. Petersen, give you, if you want to close with any comments or mention anything before I wrap it up.
I've got my mute. I would just, reiterate that it's such an amazing place. And if you get the opportunity, I highly encourage it. It's a new thing every time I go up, a new thing around every corner, new things to learn, new people. It's great.
Great.
Dustin, as well, the dog sledding, people are asking about that. The dog sledding is also phenomenal. I would recommend as well coming in to do a pre-stay and going to the zoo in advance. I highly recommend that.
Very good plug there, Rob, at the end. I like that. Dr. Petersen loves it too. No, it is true. It is true. Well, thank you so much, Rob. Thank you so much, Dr. Petersen. This was truly fascinating and informational. I'm sure it was appreciated by all. You've seen this screen now up for a while. If you do want to get more involved and visit us on Tauck.com and check out our journeys, please do so with those links and follow us on our blog. As I mentioned before, this presentation was recorded, so it will be up on our blog page at Tauck.com/blog tomorrow afternoon. Everyone will receive an email notifying you when it's ready to go, and we'll have those pictures up that Rob mentioned, so you can see those up close and personal bears, and also see the vehicles that we use. Rob has
Thanks for the great questions. Thanks for the great
yes,
questions.
thank you so much for the great questions.
An engaged group.
A ton of questions. Sorry we didn't get to them all, but hopefully we answered most of them throughout the chat. So again, thank you for those who are booked with us. Thank you for those who are interested in booking with us. And again, thank you, Dr. Petersen and Rob, for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.